So today I'll be talking a bit about how theatre of the oppressed can redefine how we look at research, how we can look at methodology in that sense. And it's not the research that I did, it came out through that process. It came out through different thoughts and conversations that I had along the way that made me look at this. So I have more questions at the end of it than answers, which I hope we can all think about at the end of it. So, but before I of course, get into the nitty-gritty of it, I should share a bit about what theatre of the oppressed means, especially for people who may not be familiar with it. And I've been doing a lot of this explaining for many years, especially within my agencies, with my classes, and also, I'm quite familiar with what this is. But basically, it's a system, it's a pedagogical tool that's been used since the 1960s by Brazilian activist, right? At one point, he was working with a community and to a rural community. So he's using theatre of the oppressed, which is a set of tools to kind of get them to be empowered to think of solutions for themselves. So it's basically working with the community to kind of just resolve their own issues that they are facing, right, in many ways. So a lot of the facets that are included in theatre of the oppressed are games, activities, a lot of play, a lot of image theatre work, which is where people express themselves using their bodies. So it's a lot of embodiment work. Forum theatre, which might be something that people might be familiar with in this space, although forum theatre in Singapore is done quite differently in different spaces depending on who's doing it and depending on who's funding it. So I think that's something that we might be familiar with. And dialogue, which is an important component in theatre of the oppressed, right, which also distinguishes it from other forms of theatre where you don't entail the embodiment, you don't entail the play with a conversation. So he draws his inspiration from Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed, where dialogue is also important, and dialogue is used as a tool to kind of subvert that form of education instead of it being a banking model where a teacher tells everything and a student absorbs everything. It shifts that power, right? You share power, you ask questions, you hear from the ground, they ask questions, and together you make meaning together, right, in that sense. So that was how theatre of the oppressed was born. It's been done in many places. It's not done a lot in Singapore. It's done in a lot more spaces in Asia as well, in India, in Taiwan, in Hong Kong. But in Singapore, there's still a bit of resistance because I do think it's because of the word oppressed. In my undergrad days, when I wanted to use this form for my thesis title, my prof told me, you can't use the word theatre of the oppressed. Call it interactive theatre. So. Which was not, right? So in many ways, I had to kind of rename it so that it would be accepted, right? So that it would be in the library of the school, and there wouldn't be a lot of resistance that I'll face from like DRC or IRB in that sense. Now it's a bit better. Now they allow me to use the full form. So, and my full form of my research has like gay, bisexual, and queer men, which is so many ticks as well. So I guess we've grown academically. So a bit about my research before I get into what I want to talk about today. So my research was to evaluate theatre of the oppressed, right? And so I worked with gay, bisexual, and queer men. So I used a mixed method study. I'm not going to get into too much details of this because that's not the point of this conversation, but I'm very happy to share about it at another point. But it's basically to use TO to evaluate the shifts in critical consciousness amongst gay, bisexual, and queer men in Singapore. So I had two groups, an intervention group and a comparison group, and I had a pre-post survey. So there's a mixed method study that was done with that. But through that process, there was an important part of it, which was the whole workshop, where I did the theatre of the oppressed part, right? So for me, that's the most exciting part about doing this research because that was the part that I wanted to do. That's the part where I bring a lot of myself into it. I hear a lot from the ground, a lot from the community that I'm working with, and a lot of the questions they bring forward. So in that process, that's where I thought about what I want to talk about today. So in the workshop, how it looks like, if I can just paint a picture, it's 5 weeks. So I work with each of the group for 5 weeks, and each week delves between 2 to 3 hours. Why I say 2 to 3 hours? We usually allocate 2 hours, but sometimes they stay a lot longer, willingly, which is surprising because sometimes you start at 7 or 8 p.m. and then they stay till like 11:30 to continue their conversations, right? And I'm the more kanchiong one. Okay, we need to end at 10. Like we should wrap up this conversation, and they are very happy to go on. So I feel like, the work pays off on its own, right? So what we do in the 2 to 3 hours is we would have curated theatre activities, which I would draw reference from various books and scholars out there, and we would capture this using video camera, participant observers in many ways. And once they get through these activities, I'll get into an example in a bit. Yeah. So once we get into these activities, then we would delve into how they experience the activity, right? What comes up for you when you participate in this game or in this activity or so, and based on what comes up for you, how would you relate this to your experience as a gay, bisexual, and queer man in Singapore? So I don't directly jump into the question of asking them what's your experience like or what are some challenges you navigate as a GBQ man. We play the game first. You think about what comes up for you from these games, and then based on what comes up for you, how would you relate this experience, right? It's not always an epiphany where they always think, yes, it comes up with something, like I can relate this. There are many times where a lot of them tell me nothing comes up for me. And then they get into a conversation, and then from that conversation, it leads into a point where they talk about their experiences. So sometimes it's not so direct in that sense. It's so depending on the activities or the stage of the group where they might talk about these activities. So basically, there are these three things that we would delve into. And so if I get into one particular example, there's this game that I often play. It's called the Colombian Hypnosis. Basically, it's where people pair up and one person stands in front of the other and uses their hand to guide their partner around the room, right? So it would seem like a game at the start, right? So it's one person leading, the other person has to follow, and then we would switch roles. So the second person would now lead this person. And during this point, we would often like pause halfway to just ask people, how was that for you, right? How was it like being led? How was it like leading someone? And how I would usually end the game is getting everyone to be in a whole string where one person leads another person. So one person's being led, but you also lead a person behind you. So they typically will go as a whole string of people moving around the space, right? So if you look at it, there'll be one person who's right in front leading the whole group, and one person right at the back being led by the whole group, and there are these people in the middle being like straddled between leading and following in that sense, right? So usually that brings out a lot of emotions from them, especially from the person right at the back who has no power at all, right? And the person right in front who has full control and full power of where the group moves and how they move. So this game was taught by, it came out by Augusto Boal, right? So he was the one who came up with Theatre of the Oppressed. So this game was supposed to bring up issues of power, but when I had this game with the participants, a lot of the theme that came up very strongly was care. How do I care for my partner? How can I ensure that my partner doesn't knock into things around the room? Which for me was a new idea that came up, right? Because it was not something that Boal had written about, but it was something that the participants had brought up, right? How can I show care? Or how do I like leading a person or following a person? And then that leads into preferences of their own relationships and how they see their dynamics with their own partners. So that conversation came up as well. So I left the discussion pretty open with the participants for them to decide where they wanted to take the conversation, right? So they could either go into the conversation of care, they could go into the conversation of dynamics in the relationship, or they can talk about power. So there were these three different divergent conversations that came up, and we left room for it until people wanted to delve deeper into that, as long as we related back to their own experiences. So so because of these different conversations, so that conversation led into them talking about their coming out experiences, and a lot of past traumas came up, and people started to share based on what one person might have shared. So even though the activity may not have led everyone to relate to a specific coming out experience, because of one person's sharing, that can create a ripple effect amongst the other participants, right? And then from there, we would delve deeper into that particular conversation in that sense. So I think my point about what I wanted to talk about was how TO in itself can redefine this qualitative data collection part. So in what I did, I was aiming to answer one question, right? Theatre of the Oppressed, how does it raise critical consciousness? So before attending, after attending, what has come up for you? So critical consciousness in the sense of like, what are the motivations you have to overcome your own struggles? What are your own awarenesses of your own struggles in that sense, right? And what are the steps you're willing to take? And what steps would you take collectively? So in the group that I did, we stopped at a point where they only had motivation to take action. So we didn't get into the action-taking part because it was only 5 weeks. I had a timeline to work with. So we stopped at that point and we measured up to that point, right? But usually, if we kept the group going, typically it would also lead into them coming up with solutions together in that sense. So I wanted to look at how TO also looks at this data collection process on its own, right? And it also got me thinking, because when I did my undergrad thesis, which is years ago, my prof at that point told me that I needed to have a theme that I wanted to talk about with youths that I was working with. So at that point, it wasn't the GBQ men that I was working with. I was working with delinquent youths, right? So youth offenders for that matter. And they wanted me to talk about bullying with them. So that was the topic they came up with. They said, how would these youths tackle bullying? Because some of them there are bullies in their own schools for whatever reason. And that was the issue that they asked me to write about, and my whole research proposal was around bullying. My introduction was about that, but I haven't even met the youths when I had thought about this conversation, right? Which was odd to me also, because that may not be what the participants may want to talk about, right? So it also made me think about how we come in with the research questions, the research discourse, without it being something that the participants or the community wants to own in that sense. Of course, in that point, when I worked with them for a much longer period, like over 9 weeks, we had a performance and all, but like over the 9 weeks, the conversation led into them talking about racial profiling, being profiled in school, this discrimination they felt in school, especially because they were from the lower streams in school. So that conversation was heavy there, also because they were centered as victims in that conversation, right? So we impose upon participants or communities about them being perpetrators or users of violence, then they become defensive in many ways, or they have other reasons as to why they might do what they are doing. But if we center them as individuals, as the subjects, as the people who are experiencing things around them, then the conversation becomes owned by them in that sense as well. So back to this, when I wanted to look at TO as an intervention here, of course this was to fulfill a much bigger picture of like how we can integrate TO into social work, right? But through this process, I also saw like how TO also allowed the participants to direct the conversations to the conversations they wanted to have. So we delved into the lived experiences of GBQ men without me asking the questions, right? So it was questions that they raised up, they wanted to talk about, right? And we deep dived into those conversations. So I also thought that one of the great things about TO is also, because of the use of play, because of the use of images, it creates these divergent perspectives. So for instance, if you using a body, create an image, right? Create like based on an expression, two people standing on different sides of the room will see different things, and different things will come up for them based on what they see, right? So this creation of divergent conversations was one thing that I thought that it would lead to. The other was also about this whole idea of this traditional researcher-led inquiries, right? Where we come up with the questions, we come up with the discourse as researchers, especially if we follow very strict IRB, DRC kind of like formats where we have to write the questions. The conversation is then owned by us, right? It doesn't go back to the community in many ways. So this also allows them to, yes, got it, yeah. So this also allows them to kind of own the questions they want to answer in many ways. And that also leads to them to social transformation, right? Where they benefit from this process of participating, the process of going through this whole this workshop of also learning how they can overcome their own struggles. So they ask the questions, they think of solutions together, and then they mobilize the action together as well. And of course, in many ways, it's also to create more interdisciplinary work between the arts and science in that sense, and to also integrate more arts work in social work, which is now increasingly becoming better, I think. I think they're more accepting of it. But I think when we think of like why we want to bring this in, we always have to have very strong reasoning. But because of the way we look at research, where we have to come up with the questions, we're not shifting the whole conversation back to the community as to how they can own the issue based on just the methodology that we bring in. Right, so what a method could potentially look like is that we would have an arts-based method, right? So it's the whole formula of the different images, the different activities that Boal and many scholars out there have written. And using these like methods, it would then create divergent conversations, divergent interpretations based on their life experiences. And then using that as a kickoff, we would have deep dive conversations and answer questions they want answered. So that's how the community can also kind of own the questions in that sense. So yeah, here are a couple of like implications that I thought, and I'm still thinking about how we might use this in research, right? So if we want to look at TO as a methodology, there are many things that we need to consider. Safety of participants, the time the participants need to get into that. It's very different from asking like a focus group discussion where you already have a set of 10 questions you want to ask groups, right? You would want to get into this whole process of getting them to build rapport, build trust, build safety, and then ask them to ask the questions they want answered. Of course, as a facilitator, there are certain backgrounds you need to have, skills you need to have in asking these questions, or even navigating the use of theatre in that sense. And of course, there's also this part of exploring this effectiveness, this program evaluation, this intervention evaluation in many sense to also see its success or effectiveness in working with different communities or using it in research per se. So yeah, I'm still left with these questions as to how we might want to adapt it within research or within qualitative research as a whole, right? In which facets we might use TO in. Yeah, and I hope we can all think about that as well. Thank you.